There's an old idea inside Shaolin monasteries that almost nobody who talks about monks ever actually mentions, because it doesn't make for a dramatic enough story, and dramatic is usually what gets clicked on. It's not about kicks, or breaking boards, or decades of meditation in a cave. It's about a room. A monk's room, in most Shaolin traditions, contains almost nothing: a mat, a few tools, a single robe, everything with its own exact place. Not because the monk owns nothing else. Because everything that isn't essential gets removed from the space where decisions happen, so the mind never has to fight its way through clutter just to think clearly. That single idea, applied correctly, resolves an enormous percentage of the problems most people carry around every single day without realizing where they actually came from. Not through willpower, not through motivation. Through 6 specific systems, borrowed loosely from that same discipline, that remove the clutter sitting between you and a mind that can actually function. Most people who feel constantly behind, constantly stressed, or constantly searching for something, an object, a decision, a moment of calm, assume the fix is more effort. Work harder, plan better, want it more. But effort was never the missing ingredient in most of these cases. What's missing is a system sitting quietly upstream of the problem, catching it before it ever has a chance to become a problem in the first place. A monk isn't calm because he's found some permanent internal peace unavailable to the rest of us. He's calm because almost every source of daily friction has already been engineered out of his environment, long before it could ever reach him. I remember the specific moment this idea actually clicked for me, rather than staying an abstract fact I'd read somewhere. I was standing in an apartment that had, by any reasonable measure, gotten completely out of control. Not dirty exactly, just chaotic, nothing with a fixed place, decisions about small requests eating hours of every week, days ending with no clear sense of what had actually been accomplished. I wasn't lazy. I was, if anything, busy constantly. But busy and functional turned out to be 2 entirely different things, and the gap between them wasn't willpower. It was the complete absence of any of the 6 systems we're about to go through. I want to be honest about something before we go further. I'm not a monk, and this isn't a video pretending Shaolin monks invented modern productivity. What I am saying is that centuries of a discipline built entirely around removing unnecessary friction from daily life produced 6 specific mechanisms that solve problems most people spend years trying to solve through motivation, willpower, or expensive apps that get abandoned within a month. These 6 systems aren't complicated. They're almost suspiciously simple, which is usually the first sign that something's actually built to last. I picked these specific 6 deliberately, rather than listing every organizational tip that exists. Each one addresses a different category of recurring problem. The empty surface and one object, one place solve the physical category: lost things, cluttered spaces, the low-grade tension of visual chaos. The single-task ritual and the closing ritual solve the temporal category: days that blur together, tasks left perpetually half-finished, focus constantly split across too many things at once. The 3-question filter and the weekly counsel solve the decision category: the exhausting accumulation of small choices made without any consistent rule, and the slow drift that happens when nothing ever pauses to notice a pattern forming. 3 categories, 2 systems each, covering the overwhelming majority of what actually generates recurring friction in an ordinary life. There's a reason I introduced them in this specific order, rather than randomly. Each system makes the next one slightly easier to install, the same way the various disciplines inside a monastery reinforce each other instead of competing for the same limited attention. An empty surface makes the single-task ritual nearly automatic. A closing ritual makes the next morning's empty surface effortless to maintain. A working 3-question filter reduces the number of things competing for space on that surface in the first place. None of these 6 exist in isolation, even though each one works as a standalone fix for its specific category of problem. Here's the claim behind the number in the title, and I want to defend it before you decide it sounds exaggerated. Look closely at almost any persistent problem in your life. Money that disappears without a clear account of where it went, days that end with nothing important accomplished, arguments that repeat because nobody remembers what was actually agreed on, a home that never quite feels calm no matter how much you clean it. Trace each one back far enough, and you rarely find a complex root cause. You find a missing system, No fixed place for the thing, no fixed rule for the decision, no fixed moment for the review. 95% isn't a promise that every problem you have is solvable by tidying a shelf. It's an observation that almost every recurring problem, the kind that shows up again and again instead of once, traces back to the absence of one of these 6 systems. I want to be precise about the distinction that number depends on, because it matters. A one-time crisis, a medical emergency, a sudden loss, an unpredictable event, isn't what these 6 systems are aimed at, and no organizational system on Earth claims to solve that kind of problem. What these systems target specifically is the recurring kind, the same argument happening for the 3rd time this month, the same object lost for the 5th time this year, the same Sunday evening spent scrambling because nothing was prepared in advance. Recurring problems, by definition, have a structural cause somewhere, because a truly random problem wouldn't repeat in the same shape over and over. Find the missing structure, and the recurrence stops. That's the actual mechanism behind the number, not a vague promise that tidying up fixes everything in life. If you're new here, this channel is built around exactly this kind of change, quiet, structural, built on systems instead of speeches. If organizing your life without turning it into a chore or a personality is something you're after, staying subscribed means you're here as more of these systems get built out, one video at a time, instead of piecing together a fraction of it from a dozen unrelated sources that were never designed to work together in the first place. A like on your way and helps this reach more people carrying problems that were never really about willpower to begin with. There's no cost to sticking around for the rest of this, and there's a real cost to closing this video and going back to whatever hasn't been working. Another month of the same recurring problems, assuming the fix is somewhere out of reach, when the actual missing piece was never complicated to begin with, just never installed as a consistent system. System 1. The empty surface. In a Shaolin monastery, surfaces stay empty by default, not because monks are minimalists in the aesthetic sense you see online, but because every object sitting on a surface is a small, constant draw on attention, whether you notice it or not. A cluttered desk doesn't just look messy. It forces your mind to filter past dozens of small, unfinished visual signals every time you sit down to focus on one thing. The system itself is simple. Pick one surface, your desk, your kitchen counter, your nightstand, and enforce a rule that nothing stays on it that doesn't have an active, same-day purpose. Everything else gets a home somewhere else, out of sight, not thrown away, just relocated to a place where it isn't constantly competing for your attention. At the end of each day, that one surface returns to empty, the same way a monk's cell returns to its baseline state before sleep. This solves more than it looks like it should. Most people don't lose things because they're forgetful. They lose things because there was never a fixed home for the object in the first place, so it ends up wherever it was last set down, indistinguishable from everything else in the pile. An empty surface, maintained daily, ends that specific category of problem almost entirely, not through better memory, but through the simple fact that there's now only one place a thing could be. There's a psychological effect at play here that's worth naming directly, because it explains why this system works even faster than people expect. A cluttered surface doesn't just make things harder to find. It produces a low, constant sense that something is unfinished, even when nothing on it is actually urgent. That ambient sense of unfinished business follows you through the rest of your day, quietly draining a small amount of attention every time your eyes pass over it, whether you consciously register it or not. An empty surface removes that ambient signal entirely, and most people report feeling calmer within days of maintaining just one, long before any of the other 5 systems are even in place. Start with the surface you interact with most, since that's where the effect will be most noticeable. For most people, that's a desk or a kitchen counter. Clear it completely once, then defend that emptiness daily rather than letting it slowly refill the way it always has before. The first clearing is the easy part. The daily defense of it is where the actual system lives. Expect resistance from the surface itself, in a sense. Old habits will keep depositing things there out of pure momentum for the first week or two, regardless of your intentions. This is normal, and it doesn't mean the system has failed. Each time you notice something has landed there, simply move it to its proper home, without frustration, the same way a monk would return a tool to its place without treating the interruption as a personal failure. The system isn't broken by the object landing there. It would only be broken by leaving it there. System 2. One object, one place. This extends the first system into your entire living space, not just one surface. Every object you own gets exactly one designated location, not somewhere in that drawer, a specific spot within that drawer. Keys hang on one hook. Chargers live in one exact spot. Documents go in one exact folder. The specificity matters more than people expect. Somewhere in the office isn't a home, it's a search radius. And a search radius is where minutes of your day quietly disappear looking for things that should have taken 0 seconds to find. Monks apply this with a rigor that looks almost excessive from the outside. Every tool in a specific place, returned immediately after use, every time, without exception. The reason isn't neatness for its own sake. It's that a mind constantly redeciding where things go, or researching for things that don't have a fixed place, is a mind spending real cognitive effort on something that shouldn't require any thought at all. Fix the location once, permanently, and that effort disappears completely, freed up for something that actually deserves it. Start small if the idea of doing this for your entire home feels overwhelming. Pick 5 objects you handle daily: keys, wallet, phone, glasses, whatever applies to you, and give each one a single, non-negotiable home. Within 2 weeks, you'll notice the specific, low-grade frustration of, where did I put this, disappearing for exactly those 5 things. And that noticeable relief is usually what convinces people to extend the system further on their own. There's a specific mistake worth avoiding here, one that quietly undermines this system for a lot of people who try it. The home for each object has to be convenient enough that returning it there is genuinely easier than setting it down anywhere else. Otherwise, the system loses to convenience within a week, the same way every habit that fights against the path of least resistance eventually does. If the hook for your keys is awkward to reach, you'll set them on the counter instead, and the whole system quietly fails, not because the idea was wrong, but because the specific location made following it harder than not following it. Choose homes that are at least as convenient as wherever the object currently tends to end up, and the system holds far more easily. It's also worth extending this principle beyond physical objects into digital ones. Files that don't have a consistent folder structure suffer from exactly the same problem as objects without a fixed home. They end up wherever they were last saved, indistinguishable from 100 other files with similarly vague names. The same rule applies. One folder, one clear naming convention, applied consistently, removes an entire category of digital searching that otherwise eats far more time across a week than most people realize. There's a version of this that applies to shared spaces too, which is worth mentioning if you live with other people. A shared home for shared objects, the one spot where remotes, chargers, or shared documents always live, removes a category of friction between people that often gets misattributed to a personality clash rather than what it actually is: 2 people operating without a shared, agreed-upon system for where things belong. Agreeing on the location once, together, tends to resolve far more low-grade household tension than most people expect from something this simple. System 3. The single-task ritual. Before any serious task, a monk clears the space physically and clears the mind deliberately. Nothing happens in a cluttered environment, and nothing happens while attention is split. This is the opposite of how most modern days are structured, where multiple tasks run in parallel, half-finished, competing constantly for the same limited attention. The system, before starting anything that requires real focus, physically clear the space around you of everything unrelated to that one task, and close or silence everything competing for your attention that isn't required for it. Not as a vague intention to focus better, but as a literal, repeated physical ritual. The same handful of seconds, every time, that signals to your mind that exactly one thing is happening now, and everything else has been deliberately set aside rather than merely ignored. This solves the problem most people misdiagnose as a lack of discipline. It's rarely a discipline problem. It's an environment problem. A desk with 6 half-finished things on it, a phone within reach, for browser tabs open from 4 unrelated tasks, all competing for the same attention that was supposed to go toward one thing. Clear the physical field before starting, every single time, and the discipline required afterward drops dramatically, because there's simply less pulling at you to resist. This connects directly back to the empty surface system, and the two reinforce each other in a way worth understanding clearly. If your default surface is already empty, the single-task ritual becomes almost effortless. There's nothing extra to clear away before starting, because nothing extra was ever allowed to accumulate there in the first place. This is one of the reasons these 6 systems were chosen as a set rather than as 6 unrelated tips. Each one makes the next one easier to maintain. The same way a monastery's various daily disciplines reinforce each other rather than existing as isolated, competing demands on attention. Make the ritual itself as short and repeatable as possible. It doesn't need to be elaborate. Closing unrelated tabs, putting the phone in another room, clearing anything unrelated off the desk, takes under a minute, done consistently, every single time before any task that requires real focus. The brevity matters. A ritual that takes 10 minutes to perform will get skipped on busy days precisely when it's needed most. A ritual that takes under a minute has no reasonable excuse against it, on even the most rushed day. It's worth being specific about what unrelated means here, since the boundary matters more than it seems. A tab for the task you're actually doing stays open. A tab you opened 3 hours ago for something completely different closes, even if you plan to get back to it later. Later has its own moment coming, and it doesn't need to compete with right now. This distinction, applied consistently, is what separates genuine single-tasking from the illusion of it that most people settle for, where a dozen things stay technically open in the background while attention quietly fragments across all of them without anyone fully noticing how much focus that fragmentation is actually costing. Before we go further into the systems, I want to pause here, because everything we've covered so far, the empty surface, the fixed location for every object, the single-task ritual, depends on one thing underneath all of it: actually doing it consistently, on the days it feels unnecessary as much as the days it feels obviously worth it. That consistency is exactly what the K.M.A method is built to train. 5 minutes a day, aimed directly at the moment resistance shows up right before a small, necessary action, so that maintaining these systems stops depending on motivation and starts running as something closer to automatic. I've used a version of this training during a period where my own environment had slipped completely out of order. Piles everywhere, no fixed place for anything, every task competing with 3 others for attention. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was that the small resistance before putting something back in its place, or clearing a desk before starting real work, got quieter and passed faster, almost every single time. That's exactly what training this specific mechanism is supposed to produce. And it's the difference between a system you set up once and abandon within a week, and one that's still running 6 months later. What surprised me most, looking back, was how much of what I'd previously labeled as disorganization was actually just this same resistance, showing up dozens of times a day in small, easily missed moments. Putting something down instead of putting it away, leaving a tab open instead of closing it, starting a new task before properly closing the last one. None of those moments feel significant individually. Multiplied across a week, they're the entire difference between an environment that runs itself and one that quietly falls apart no matter how good your intentions were on day one. If you want to see exactly how this training works, point your camera at the QR code on screen right now, or check the link in the description. Take 30 seconds to look at it, and then come back, because there are still 3 more systems to cover, and they matter just as much as the first 3. System 4, the closing ritual. Every evening, a monk's space returns to its baseline state before sleep. Nothing left half done, nothing left out of place, the day deliberately closed rather than simply abandoned wherever it happened to end. This is one of the most overlooked reasons monastic life feels calm from the outside. Not because nothing difficult happens during the day, but because every day gets a defined ending, instead of quietly bleeding into the next one with loose and still hanging. The system, at a fixed time each evening, spend 5 minutes returning your immediate space to its baseline. The empty surface from System 1 restored, tomorrow's essentials set out. Anything left mid-task either finished or deliberately paused with a clear note of where it left off. This isn't about intensity. It's about closure. A day that ends cleanly, even when the day itself was hard or unproductive, sets up the next day to start from a stable baseline instead of inheriting yesterday's chaos on top of its own. Most people who feel like they're always behind aren't actually behind on the work itself. They're behind because every day starts by first cleaning up the mess the previous day left before any new progress can even begin. A closing ritual, 5 minutes, done consistently, removes that inherited debt entirely. So each day genuinely starts at zero instead of already carrying yesterday's unfinished weight. There's a specific detail worth adding here, because it's what separates a real closing ritual from a vague intention to tidy up before bed. Pick a fixed sequence, in a fixed order, every single night. Surface cleared, tomorrow's essentials set out. One line written about anything left unfinished and exactly where it stands. The sequence itself doesn't need to be elaborate, but it needs to be identical every night, because identical sequences become automatic far faster than sequences that vary depending on mood or energy that day, and a sequence that changes shape every night never gets the chance to stop requiring conscious thought. If 5 minutes feels like too much some nights, don't skip the ritual entirely, shrink it instead. A 30-second version, just the surface and nothing else, still preserves the core function. A day that closes deliberately rather than one that simply stops when exhaustion takes over. The full version can wait for tomorrow. The habit of closing something every single night is what actually matters. There's a specific reason this ritual belongs at the end of the day rather than somewhere in the middle, even though it might seem like it could happen anytime. Ending the day with a deliberate closing signals, physically and psychologically, that the day is genuinely over. A signal most people never give themselves, which is part of why so many describe lying in bed still mentally running through unfinished tasks. A closing ritual gives your mind explicit permission to stop, something it rarely gets otherwise, and that permission alone tends to improve the transition into actual rest far more than people expect from something this small. System 5. The 3-question filter. Monastic life runs on extremely few decisions per day, not because monks lack choices, but because a filter exists upstream of most decisions, resolving them before they ever have to be consciously weighed. Most modern stress doesn't come from big decisions. It comes from the accumulated weight of dozens of small ones, made without any consistent rule, every single day. The system, before agreeing to anything, a request, an obligation, a new commitment, run it through 3 questions. Does this genuinely need to happen? Does it need to happen now? Does it need to happen through me specifically? Most requests fail at least one of these 3 questions, and the ones that pass all 3 are the only ones that actually deserve a yes. Everything else gets declined, delayed, or delegated, using the filter itself as the reason rather than a personal judgment call that has to be re-argued every single time. This system solves a problem that looks like poor time management from the outside, but is almost always something else entirely: the absence of a consistent rule for what deserves your yes. Without a filter, every request gets evaluated individually, in the moment, usually under some social pressure to agree, and that individual evaluation is exhausting in a way a fixed rule never is. Build the filter once, apply it consistently, and an enormous number of daily decisions stop requiring any real thought at all. I want to walk through why each of the 3 questions does specific work, because using them mechanically, without understanding why they matter, tends to make people abandon the filter the first time it produces an uncomfortable answer. Does this genuinely need to happen? Filters out obligations that exist purely out of habit or inertia, things nobody would actually miss if they quietly stopped happening. Does it need to happen now? Filters out the urgency most requests carry that doesn't actually match their real importance. Plenty of things are legitimate but don't need to happen this week, let alone today. Does it need to happen through me specifically? Filters out the obligations that exist only because nobody else was ever asked, not because you're genuinely the only person capable of handling them. The discomfort of saying no, even when the filter clearly says no, is real, and it's worth naming directly rather than pretending the filter removes that discomfort entirely. What it does is give you a clean, external reason for the no, rather than forcing you to construct one on the spot every single time, which is where most of the actual exhaustion of constant small decisions comes from in the first place. It helps to write the 3 questions down somewhere visible, at least for the first month, rather than trying to hold them entirely in memory during a moment of social pressure. A request comes in, and instead of answering immediately, there's a genuine pause. even just a few seconds, to actually run it through the filter rather than defaulting to the automatic yes most people have practiced their entire lives. That pause is small, but it's exactly where the real work of this system happens. Skip the pause, and the filter exists only in theory, never actually applied at the moment it would matter most. System 6. The Weekly Council. Once a week, monastic communities typically hold some form of structured reflection, not a vague check-in, but a deliberate review of what worked, what didn't, and what needs to change before the next week begins. Most people never do this in any form. They live week to week reactively, repeating the same friction points indefinitely because nothing ever pauses long enough to actually notice the pattern. The system, once a week, at a fixed time, spend 15 minutes reviewing the previous 7 days against the 5 systems above. Did the empty surface stay empty? Did objects return to their fixed places? Did the closing ritual happen most nights? Did the 3-question filter actually get used, or did old habits creep back in around it? This isn't about judging yourself harshly for an imperfect week. It's about catching drift early, before a missed system quietly becomes a permanently abandoned one. This is the system that makes the other 5 sustainable long-term, rather than just for the first motivated week or two. Without a weekly review, every system slowly decays without anyone noticing exactly when or why. With one, decay gets caught within days instead of months, and course-correcting a few days of drift is a completely different task than trying to rebuild a system that's been abandoned for half a year. Keep the review itself simple and consistent. The same fixed questions, the same fixed time, every week, without exception. Resist the urge to turn it into an elaborate self-assessment with dozens of criteria. The value comes from the consistency of a short review, not from the depth of an occasional long one. 15 minutes. The same 5 questions about the 5 systems above, plus a 6th question about the review itself. Is this weekly council actually happening consistently, or has it started slipping too? There's a specific pattern worth watching for during this review, one that catches almost everyone at some point. It's tempting to skip naming a failure honestly, softening "I didn't do this at all" into "I did this sometimes," because the honest version feels uncomfortable to write down. Resist that softening. The review only works as a diagnostic tool if it reflects what actually happened, not the version of the week you'd prefer to remember. An honest, slightly uncomfortable review, done weekly, will save you from months of quiet, undiagnosed drift that a comfortable, dishonest one never catches in time. Consider pairing this review with the same notebook or space you might already use for other reflection, rather than introducing an entirely new tool just for this. The fewer separate places your systems live, the less likely any one of them is to quietly get forgotten in the shuffle of everyday life. A single page, once a week, with the same 6 questions answered honestly, is a small enough ritual that it survives busy weeks the same way the other 5 systems are designed to. So what should you actually expect from running all 6 of these systems together, starting from an environment and a schedule that currently has none of them? Don't expect an immediate transformation. The first week will feel like extra effort layered on top of an already busy life, because none of these 6 have automated yet. Somewhere around week 2, the empty surface and the fixed object locations start requiring noticeably less conscious effort. By week 4, most people report the closing ritual and the 3-question filter running almost automatically, with the weekly council becoming the anchor that catches whatever's still slipping. Let me break this down more specifically, because vague timelines are part of why people abandon systems like these before they've had a fair chance to work. In week 1, expect every single system to still feel like a deliberate decision, including the ones that seem simple on paper. This is normal, not a sign the systems are wrong for you. In week 2, the physical systems tend to stabilize first. The empty surface stops requiring conscious thought, and returning objects to their fixed places starts happening almost without noticing. In week 3, the single-task ritual and the closing ritual typically start merging into a natural rhythm around work and sleep, rather than feeling like extra steps bolted onto an already full day. By week 4, the 3-question filter is usually the last piece to feel automatic, simply because changing a decision pattern takes longer than changing a physical one, and the weekly council should be running consistently enough by then to catch whatever hasn't stabilized yet. Expect some systems to stick faster than others. The physical ones, the empty surface, one object, one place, tend to show results within days because the effect is immediately visible. The decision-based ones, the three-question filter especially, take longer because changing a decision pattern requires catching yourself in the moment repeatedly before the new pattern feels natural instead of effortful. It's worth being honest about a specific kind of disappointment that tends to show up around week 3. The sense that despite doing everything correctly, some deeper problem hasn't disappeared the way you'd hoped. This is worth sitting with rather than dismissing. These 6 systems solve recurring, structural problems extremely well. They are not designed to solve every kind of difficulty a person faces, and expecting them to do so sets up a disappointment that has nothing to do with whether the systems themselves are working. What they will do, reliably, is remove an enormous amount of the daily friction that made everything else in your life feel harder than it needed to be. And that alone is worth the effort of installing them properly. A few things to watch out for as you build these 6 systems. Don't try to implement all 6 perfectly in the same week. Start with the empty surface and the closing ritual, since those two reinforce each other directly, and only add the rest once those two feel close to automatic. Trying to install all 6 at once, especially the decision-based ones, tends to overload the exact mental bandwidth these systems are meant to free up in the first place. This particular caution matters more than it might seem, because the appeal of a video like this one is often the desire to fix everything at once, right now, after finally understanding what was missing. That urge is understandable, but it recreates the exact overload these systems exist to prevent. 2 systems, running consistently, will do more for you in a month than 6 systems attempted simultaneously and abandoned within 2 weeks because none of them had room to actually stabilize. Don't mistake a messy day for a failed system. Monks have hard days too. The point of these systems was never to prevent difficulty. It's to make sure difficulty doesn't compound into permanent disorder. One day where the surface stays cluttered, or the closing ritual gets skipped, is just one day. The weekly counsel is specifically where you catch that before it becomes a pattern, not a reason to declare the whole system a failure after a single rough week. There's a related trap worth naming clearly: perfectionism disguised as high standards. Some people, once they understand these systems, become harsher on themselves for every small lapse than they ever were before encountering any of this, treating a single missed closing ritual as evidence the entire approach has failed. That reaction does more damage than the original clutter ever did, because it turns a forgiving, sustainable system into a rigid standard nobody could maintain indefinitely. The systems are meant to reduce friction, including the friction of self-judgment over an imperfect week. And don't turn any of these 6 into an identity performance instead of a working system. It's tempting, especially with anything borrowed from monastic tradition, to start treating minimalism or discipline as a personality to display rather than a mechanism to use. The value here isn't in looking disciplined. It's in the actual reduction of friction these systems produce in your daily life, whether or not anyone else ever notices you've built them. One final caution, aimed at the 3-question filter specifically, since it's the system most likely to create friction with other people rather than just with yourself. Applying the filter honestly will sometimes mean disappointing people who are used to an automatic yes from you. That discomfort is a real cost of the system, not a sign you're applying it wrong. Most people, over time, adjust their expectations once they understand your yes has become more selective and more reliable. But the adjustment period itself can feel uncomfortable, and it's worth expecting that discomfort rather than being surprised by it. It's worth adding one more nuance here that people sometimes miss. The filter isn't meant to make you someone who says no to everything. It's meant to make your yes actually mean something again, because it's no longer handed out automatically to every request regardless of its actual weight. A selective yes carries far more value, both to you and to the people receiving it, than a reflexive one given out of habit or social pressure. And that shift in how your agreement is perceived tends to improve relationships over time rather than damage them, even though the transition period can feel uncomfortable. If you've made it this far, here's what I want you to understand clearly about why these 6 systems solve as much as they do. None of them require you to become a fundamentally different, more disciplined person. They require removing the small, constant sources of friction that made discipline feel necessary in the first place. The missing home for an object, the cluttered surface, the day that never properly ends, the decision made without a consistent filter. That's exactly the same principle the K.M.A method was built around. 5 minutes a day, aimed directly at the moment resistance shows up, so that maintaining systems like these 6 stops, depending on how disciplined you feel that day, and starts running as something closer to automatic. Think about how many organizational systems you've probably tried before this one. An app, a planner, a color-coded system that looked impressive for the first week. Most of them fail for the same reason. Nothing was training the actual moment where the new system meets resistance, day after day, especially on the days it feels easiest to skip. That's the gap this fills, underneath whatever system you're actually trying to run, whether it's one of these 6 or something else entirely. If you're serious about actually keeping these 6 systems running past the first motivated week, this is worth 5 minutes of your time today. Point your camera at the QR code on screen, or check the link in the description, and take a real look at it before you close this video. Now, here's what I want you to actually do before you go anywhere else. Pick one system from this list, just one, and set it up today, in the next 10 minutes if at all possible. Not all 6. One empty surface, cleared right now, before you do anything else, before this feeling of clarity has a chance to fade the way good intentions usually do once the video ends and the rest of the day takes back over. Tell me in the comments which one of these 6 you're starting with, and which recurring problem in your life you suspect actually traces back to a missing system rather than a lack of discipline. I want to see the real, specific problems people have been carrying around, because naming the actual missing system, out loud, is often the first step toward finally resolving it, in a way vague frustration never quite manages to be. Be specific in the comment, the same way every system on this list depends on specificity to actually work. Not, I want to be more organized, but the actual system, the actual first action, and the actual recurring problem you think it connects to. If you've spent years assuming a certain kind of stress or friction was just part of your personality, it's worth considering, seriously, that it might have been a missing system the entire time, quietly waiting to be named. If this gave you an actual mechanism instead of another vague push toward being more organized, subscribe, and share it with someone who's been fighting the same recurring problem for years without ever tracing it back to its actual source. Send it without any commentary attached if that feels easier. Sometimes a video like this one makes the point more clearly than any message you could write to go along with it. There's a full system being built here, one piece at a time, for people who'd rather solve something quietly than talk about solving it. Amongst K.M.A was never about having fewer problems than everyone else. It was about removing, deliberately and consistently, the small structural gaps where most problems are allowed to repeat. 6 systems, applied consistently, do the exact same thing for an ordinary, modern life, not by eliminating difficulty, but by making sure difficulty stops compounding into the same recurring problem, month after month, for reasons that were always fixable and simply hadn't been named yet. None of this requires a monastery, a robe, or years of discipline most people will never have access to. It requires an empty surface, a fixed home for a handful of objects, a ritual before focused work, a ritual at the end of the day, 3 questions before a yes, and 15 honest minutes once a week. That's the entire system, in full, stripped of anything ceremonial or complicated. What's left is simple enough that the only real obstacle left is whether you actually start today, or whether this becomes one more video you agreed with and never applied. Keep building. Quietly, if you have to. Just keep building. 6 systems, one at a time, starting today, not next Monday, not once the schedule clears, today.